Zenfam, I've been having a wee thought today. Something occurred to me about the early days of the 3D gaming generation. The start of things as we know them now. When we think back to the original days of the PlayStation, that PlayStation wasn't alone. When I used to go up to the high street and I'd play in like Virgin and I'd play in HMV in their gaming sections at their console stands, there was a number of machines back then. There was the Atari Jaguar, there was the Panasonic 3D Reel, there was of course the PlayStation, the early PSX, and there was also the Dreamcast. Now the Dreamcast was a really interesting system. I mean, what a lot of people don't know is the Dreamcast was technically the first system to go online. You could actually play against other people without them being in your house. Now, it was early internet, so it was all like internet. I mean, really horrible, but it was possible. And it had a really interesting controller, and it had that little sub-controller that you could also play games on itself that basically could hold game information of not just you, but how your friends play. So technically speaking, you play your friends when your friends weren't there. That other people have done this sort of stuff over the years on systems. But it was Dreamcast that came up because Sega have always been somewhat pioneering. I mean, I think to some of the stuff that Sega did in the arcades. Wow. I mean, it was Sega that did a lot of really interesting moves. That's what made them so much of a competitor for Nintendo. Because Nintendo have always been super creative as well. And creativity is what makes gaming at its best. When developers are able to go, what if we do this? And that's one of the reasons why so many people now go, well, that's why gaming seems to be lacking something, because the creatives are held back to a certain extent because the moneyed interest is all about, well, this worked last time, so let's do it next time and make some more money again. And I can see the logic in that, but then the whole problem with that is gamers get bored with the same thing over and over again, and we lose interest and we move on to the next thing. But thinking about those early days of the Dreamcast, I've often wondered, what would it be like if the Dreamcast hadn't gone wrong? If the Dreamcast had actually been successful. Now, if the Dreamcast had been successful, that would have changed the whole landscape. Sony would not have had such a massive foothold in the industry. There would have been more competition for games to come to their system, because Sega would have put their games primarily on their system, whilst after their system failed, their games went everywhere, eventually even to Nintendo systems. In fact, that would change Nintendo's outlook, because we would no longer, or rather we wouldn't have, Sonic and Mario at the Olympics. We might have got more Dreams games, Nights and Dreams. We might have got more Daytona. We definitely would have got more interesting Sonic sooner in 3D, I think. In fact, I don't know if Sonic would even have gone through its dark period. There definitely would have been a higher level of cartoony styled games, but done in a 3D engine, which then would have left Sony in a funny place, because then they would have looked like they were copying them, if indeed in this alternate reality stuff like Bubsy 3D, Crash Bandicoot, Croc, and other such games would have still come out. They would have looked like they were copying Sega. When we all know that these games were, in our reality, one of the things that actually made Sony stand apart. It's a funny old thing. And what would it have been like trying to compare the original Sony controller against the Sega controller? When you consider that the Dreamcast controller functionally did more than the original PlayStation controller. Now, the only thing that was missing was the ergonomics. I mean, the original PlayStation controller was far more ergonomically pleasing in the hand, and it was lighter. But with the online capabilities as they stood at that point, and Sega's ability to draw from their arcade past, if things had gone right for the Dreamcast, would Sony be as popular as they are now? Would Nintendo? Would Microsoft have still tried to buy out, or at least merge themselves with Sega to get in to the console space? Would Microsoft have even have tried to get into the console space? Because at that point there would have, Sega would still be making consoles, Nintendo would still be making consoles, and Sony would still be making consoles. Now, Sony might not be doing as well, but I think given the early PlayStation games, especially from Namco, I think Sony would still be doing respectably. I don't know if they would have sold as many units, but I think they still would have sold a significant amount to still be viable. So roll that on a few years, I think that then the PlayStation 2, it would have actually been a fully online system. Never mind that add-on for the American market for that particular Final Fantasy game I can't remember the name of right now, which was the only online game for the PS2. And in that case, because Sega had done that and Sega had kept the Dreamcast going, that meant when it comes for the next generation, there would have been a successor to the Dreamcast. Which would then mean that like Nintendo and Sony, their PlayStation, the PlayStation 2, and I think if I'm right that would make it be probably the GameCube? Yeah, it would be the GameCube. Because it was the N64 was before the GameCube. But then Nintendo's always been that half-generational step out of line with the rest of the industry. Might they actually might they have not fallen into that pattern? Perhaps they would actually be in the same generational stepping. So then that means that the whole shift of technological development through the 90s and into the early thousands would have changed how the GameCube and the Wii U, and even up to the Switch, their whole thing would have been different. And perhaps Nintendo may not have been so experimental when it came to the Game Boy series. They would definitely have done the Game Boy Color. But would they have done the DS? Would they have done the 3DS? It all makes interesting. I think they might not have done the Game Boy Color. I think they might have gone straight to the 3DS. Not even the DS. They would have tried to differentiate themselves, because if the Dreamcast had still been successful, given that Sega liked doing handheld systems, because they saw some success with the Sega Game Gear, which I had, and it was a good wee system. What would it have been like if that had existed? If there had been another Sega handheld to compete with the Nintendo handhelds that were in existence? The Game Boy was already in existence. And I think we'd had the colour Game Boy by that point. Now we were still a year or two away from, obviously, from the DS and 3DS and 2DS and all the DS line. But also then making me think that if Sega had their handheld for that next generation, and Nintendo had their handheld, that they've always done handhelds, I mean, even back to like the Game & Watch kind of era, that when it came to the PS2, in the PS2 era, that's when we got the PSP. Now, would the PSP have seen greater success because there would have been a more intentional focus on how to make their handheld better than the other two handhelds on the market? In fact, if they'd done that, if the PSP had been more focused on gaming and less focused maybe on media, or maybe even more focused on media, being a more all-rounded device, because it would also, because it also, remember, it did MP3 music. You could use it as a music player, use it as a web engine. It played movies and it played video games, which then of course led us to how we were with the PlayStation 3, which then of course led us to the Vita, which then would it mean that the Vita would actually have had some real funding behind it and some real intentionality? Does that mean that if Sega had continued to make success and really make a go of the Dreamcast, that right now we would actually have already had and probably be thinking of as retro the Vita 2, which would then mean that the PlayStation Portable wouldn't exist because there would be no need for it to exist, because it would have been a successful working Vita Mark II, whatever they would have called it. They might not have called it the Vita. They might have called it something else. Maybe it was still called the PlayStation Portable. Holding on from the name from the old system, but having the iconography of the now system. Maybe we'd be looking at an actual Vita 2, but by a different name. So when you start thinking fourth dimensionally like this, you can go down all kinds of crazy rabbit holes. It's a very entertaining sort of way to spend an afternoon or your day off work, considering what might have been. Because if Sega had continued to be a force in gaming and console development, how would that have changed the Wii when it came out? Because remember, when the Wii came out, it exploded. You couldn't get a Wii. You think it was hard getting hold of a PlayStation 5. Try getting hold of a Wii for the first couple of years. That was crazy. Somehow I managed it, and I bought a Wii for my wife for Christmas. And it still sits down there. Oh god, yeah, the Wii. And I even did a review way back in the days of the channel when my friend had a Wii U. And I covered the differences of Wii U Black Flag to Black Flag on the PS3. Or was it PS2? No, it was PS3. It's PS3. And I compared and contrasted them. Yeah, it was a bit of a quick and dirty video, but it was before I had a proper intro and stuff. But yeah, man, wild stuff, absolutely wild stuff. But I'd love to get your thoughts down below. How would you imagine it to all have turned out? What steps would have changed? What wouldn't have changed? What would have been irrevocably altered if the Dreamcast had been a full-fledged success and Sega had stayed in the console market? What would be the ripples in the pond of time from that development? I mean, that would be a fun place for your brain to take a wee walk and a wee type down below. Okay guys, hashtag support Scottish YouTubers, and of course, as always, No bother.